Okay, here's the agenda for today's lecture. Introduction, we're going to look at the various centuries of Christianity pushing out beyond its own borders, and then a quick conclusion. Okay, most of the stuff covered in your text, most of the stuff we've talked about in the past, this just crystallizes it for you to set this up. All right, this is Christianity when it goes out and tries to duplicate itself throughout the planet. It's essentially what's going on here. It's a missionary movement. From its very beginnings, Christianity has been characterized as a missionary activity. Paul of Tarsus, or St. Paul, as sometimes he's referred to. All right. He's renowned. He's famous for his missionary journeys, spreading Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Okay. In the early Middle Ages, missionaries worked to convert the Germanic tribes who had taken control of the Roman Empire and to spread Christianity beyond the borders of the the old Roman Empire. So you have people like St. Patrick of Ireland, Augustine of Canterbury, not the St. Augustine that you know from the Middle Ages, from North Africa, a different Augustine working out of England. All right. He arrived in the 6th century. Boniface, known as the Apostle to Germany, and his cousin Leobald, right, in the 7th and 8th century. And then in the East, you have Cyril and Methodius, apostles to the Slavs, all right, around the 9th century. Some very famous missionaries who went out and were very successful at spreading Christianity across Europe, all right? So here's a map, the extent of Christianity in the early periods and the darker orange, and then as it moves out in the golden color. Okay, and you can see the spread. Okay, this is in the first 3 centuries or the first 6 centuries. Islam, basically, its greatest effect was to slow down the missionary efforts put out by Christians, with its rapid rise in the 7th century. Itself also a very vigorous missionary religion. Okay, so Christianity then began concentrating on keeping rather than expanding. So the focus was on maintaining Christianity where they currently were and holding back the very aggressive Islamic missionary movements. Okay. So, globalization. The world's Christians focuses on the 6th to the 20th centuries because it was in those centuries that Christianity truly became global. Throughout this course, we have been situating Christianity within the larger cultural, social, economic, historical, and political contexts because Christianity is so intertwined with these factors. The same is true here. The world's Christians provides a framework within which to examine and think about the interactions between Christianity and the cultures and nations that it encounters. So globalization, this is when powerful global actors export or impose their ways on doing things on others. All right, this is page 358 from your text. All right. It's regarding religion specifically. It is the spread of one largely unchanged variety of faith around the world. On the other hand, globalization implies local entrepreneurs, social, cultural, business, creatively mixing together bits and pieces from different cultures of the world to create new hybrid realities. All right. So regarding religion specifically, it implies indigenous enculturation and local adaptation. It is this very dynamic that we're asking you to focus on in your essays. In every era of Christianity, both of these dynamics, globalization and globalization, were operative. They continue to be operative today. As stated in The World's Christians, as stated, the world's Christians identifies these processes at work in each of the centuries from the 16th to the 20th. So basically the 16th century, often referred to as the age of discovery. Due to science, the invention of new navigational technology in the 15th century, this initiated a new period of Christian expansion. The ability to determine latitude by the stars and advances in map making enabled the Portuguese and the Spanish to sail around the expansive Muslim territories. They didn't have to travel on land through them. They could sail around them. This enabled the Spanish and the Portuguese to expand in their empires and reconquering formerly Christian territories. So this was known as the Age of Discovery. Western imperialism. This is the, deliberate expansion of Christianity intertwined with Western imperialism. This is the expansion of European economic and political control over Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The primary motivation behind these voyages of discovery was the quest for new trade routes to the Far East. Okay? For centuries, Europeans had enjoyed spices and luxury goods from the Middle East, from China, India, Japan, Africa. These came through overland trade routes, but they were forced to pay high prices to Muslim traders and the Italian cities who dominated the western end of the spice trade. So merchants in Spain, Portugal, England, and France wanted to find more direct routes to the Orient that would enable them to cut out the Italian and the Muslim middleman. Right? It's amazing how much economics drives research and discovery. So European rulers hoped not only for freer trade with these countries, but intended to make these countries colonies under their rule. This would give them control over their resources. Precious metals, gold, silver, diamonds, plants, rubber, tobacco, spices, animals with beaver pelts, fish, the cod fisheries, and human population for slaves. The Portuguese under Vasco da Gama found a sea route to India by sailing around the coast of Africa in 1498. All right. They broke the shipping monopoly the Arabs had in the Indian Ocean. Then they sailed eastward until they reached China and Japan. The Spanish were the first to discover, for the lack of a better verb, the Americas. Christopher Columbus set out across the Atlantic to find trade route to the Far East. In 1492, he reached the Caribbean, still known as the West Indies, because he thought he had reached India. The Spanish established colonies along the western coast of South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and western regions of North America. Evangelization and conversion of these peoples, these newly discovered lands, to Christianity was integral to the process of colonization. Since the Portuguese and the Spanish were the main players in the Age of Discovery, this was primarily a Roman Catholic endeavor. Okay? So, the Catholic Church. The church also had an interest in these discoveries for the following reasons. They were in a struggle with Islam since the 11th century. They had a very particular belief that apart from Christ, there is no salvation. The desire for salvation of the souls of these unbaptized populations. And the Pope raises papal authority to new heights by claiming authority over the non-Christians of the world. In order to encourage monarchs to support evangelization in non-Christian lands, the popes granted more and more control over church affairs to the Portuguese rulers to make it worth their while. As the Portuguese assumed control over the west coast of Africa, the Pope conferred the rights of ownership, rights to collect tithes, appoint ecclesiastical leaders, the right to enslave the Africans, and the responsibility to spread the Christian faith in the territories claimed by Portugal. When Christopher Columbus started to claim territory in the name of Spain, he was competing with Portugal in empire building. The Pope drew a line down the Atlantic. Right, this is the map from page 360 of your text, upholding Portugal's claim to control Africa, granting Spain the Americas. The line was adjusted when Portugal discovered Brazil. The responsibility invested by the popes on the monarchs of Portugal and Spain to evangelize all non-Catholic peoples in their colonial domains became a rationale for Spanish and Portuguese colonization of newly discovered peoples around the world. We have higher motives than economic and political gain. Missionary priests accompanied the explorers and early colonists. So far, this fits the concept of global endeavor, the imposition of European political and economic control, European Christianity on the rest of the globe. Missionaries versus colonists. The goal of the church to save souls and the goal of the colonists to amass wealth were in fundamental disagreement. Clerical authority often clashed with secular authority. The first priest in America lasted only a year before he returned to Spain. That is not to say that missionaries are not complicit in the destruction of indigenous civilizations and ways of life, which characterize the colonization of India, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But they often resisted and worked to counteract the greedy cruelty and tyranny of the colonists. Bartolomé de las Casas, a settler in Santo Domingo, the island of Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic. A system of encomienda, or trust in Spanish territories, it was forbidden to enslave the Indians. But groups of them were entrusted to a settler in order to civilize them and teach them Christian doctrine. In exchange for settlers' guidance, the natives were to work for him. The result was worse than outright slavery. For those who held trusts, the encomenderos had no investment in the natives. They were not their property and therefore no reason to be concerned with their welfare. After hearing a Dominican missionary, Antonio Montesinos, preach against the practice, he gave up his encomienda and from that point on openly declared that Christian faith was incompatible with the exploitation of the natives by the Spanish. He joined the Dominicans. He proposed a new system of evangelization whereby missionaries would found villages of free indigenous people as a means of peaceful evangelization, but it failed. Also surprisingly, was not popular with the colonists. He was made bishop of Chiapas, but when he refused to grant absolution to the colonists for holding natives in encomienda, he was driven from the area. Nevertheless, he was instrumental in the promulgation of new laws in the 1540s, which were intended to free the natives from this encomienda. He wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies in 1542 about the mistreatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas in colonial times. Glocal developments. Despite the overwhelming global approach of the colonizers, your text points out that many indigenous peoples seem genuinely to have embraced Christianity, making it their own, but mixing together European Christianity with local customs and understandings to create new glocal versions of Catholicism that better served indigenous needs. A great example is Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mexico. Okay? Following the conquest in 1519 to 21, the Spanish destroyed a temple of the mother goddess Tonantzin at Tepeyac, Mother Earth, just outside Mexico City, and built a chapel dedicated to the Virgin on the site. Okay? Newly converted natives continued to come from afar to worship there, often addressing the Virgin Mary as Tonantzin. The Roman Catholic Church endorses the story of the miraculous appearance of Mary. She is said to have appeared to an Aztec man who was a Christian convert. In his own language, she told him she desired a church to be built in that place where his people may experience her compassion. Of course, the bishop wouldn't believe him, so she gave him a sign, a picture of herself impressed on the inside of his cloak. Eventually, the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe built, and the image hung there. It isn't important to our discussion whether or not the apparition was real. What is important is the adaptation of a Christian practice, devotion to the Mary, the Mother of God, to indigenous culture, Aztec Mother Goddess. It also demonstrates how global and glocal processes are intertwined. Conversion to Christianity was important to the colonial project, global. The indigenous people identified the mother of the Christian God with the mother of their gods, whom they called Tonantzin, which means our mother. And this is glocal. The text provides other examples of this intertwining of global and glocal processes in the discussion of the Portuguese in Africa. So a video about the Lady of Guadalupe. It's very short.
Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared on Tepeyac Hill to Juan Diego, a humble peasant farmer in Mexico, on December 12, 1531. It was just before dawn, and Juan Diego was hurrying to Mass. As he passed Tepeyac Hill, he heard what he described as the sound of birds singing. When he investigated, he witnessed the Virgin Mary in a miraculous apparition. She instructed him to tell his bishop to construct a temple on the spot of her appearance. He obeys, but the bishop is skeptical and demands a sign. The Virgin Mary sends Juan Diego back to the bishop with roses, which do not bloom on Tepeyac Hill in December, and with a miraculous painting of her apparition on his tilma. Word quickly spreads about the apparition, and approximately 8 million people convert to Christianity. Pilgrims come from across Mexico to see Juan Diego's tilma for themselves. A church is quickly built on this site, and over the coming centuries it will be expanded, and new facilities will be built to accommodate the pilgrims. Today, the basilica where the tilma is displayed is the single most visited pilgrimage in the Americas. Juan Diego's tilma remains on display nearly 500 years after Our Lady's apparition. It should have turned to dust after just a few decades. It is protected in a case 30 feet off the ground behind bulletproof glass as one of Mexico's most treasured relics. The imagery on the tilma is highly symbolic. Our Lady of Guadalupe appears as a native Mexican princess, standing before the sun and over the crescent moon, revealing that she is more powerful than the Aztec gods. Yet her head is bowed and her hands are folded in prayer. She is not herself God. Her mantle shows the stars as they appeared in the sky above Juan Diego on that fateful morning. Our Lady of Guadalupe is the patroness of the Americas. Her feast day is on December 12th. If Our Lady of Guadalupe inspires you or someone you know, we encourage you to shop for her items by clicking on CatholicShopping.com for a one-of-a-kind shopping experience. To learn more about Our Lady of Guadalupe, visit Catholic.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us how much you love our videos in the comments.
All right. The first forays of Protestantism outside of Europe were to North America. As we've already discussed, Protestants traveled to North America in search of religious freedom for themselves rather than spreading Christianity among the natives. The world's Christians calls Protestant colonization of North America as displacement settlement. Rather than trying to colonize the natives, they colonized the land, pushing natives out of their land so that they could settle the lands themselves. In what has become the United States, this resulted at first in simply transplanting European Protestantism. However, over time, the desire for religious freedom that brought many of the colonizers to America led to the development of a new kind of Christian society, one in which religious diversity was valued. All right. At least let's just say among Christians, diversity was valued. It doesn't mean they valued other non-Christian religious traditions, but at least among themselves, yes, diversity for Christians is okay. Roman Catholics settling in North America. They, on the other hand, continued to spread Christianity around the globe, including North America. The Jesuits, founded in 1540, became the most important missionary order in the Roman Catholic Church in this period. They were convinced Gloccalists, convinced that Christianity had to be adapted to the different cultures in which it found itself. Unlike the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who generally felt that Christian missions should confront pagan cultures rather than accommodate to them, their founder, Ignatius Loyola, told his followers to become all things to all people, a basic missionary principle founded on the words and example of St. Paul. Attention to and respect for the culture values of those whom they had hoped to convert came to characterize the missionary activity of the Jesuits. This put them at odds with the imperial powers of Europe, especially Spain and Portugal. The World's Christians illustrates the glottal approach of the Jesuits with Matteo Ricci, 1552 to 1610, an Italian Jesuit in China. Here he is portrayed as dressed in traditional Chinese robes. A few weeks ago, you viewed a clip from the movie The Mission about the Guarani mission in South America, which also illustrates the Jesuit commitment to gloccalization. But I'm going to use an example closer to home, all right? The Jesuits of New France. Has anyone been up to the Martyrs Shrine in Midland, Ontario? This is the home base of a group of Jesuits known today as the Canadian Martyrs. Their leader was Jean de Breuf, 1592 to 1649, in New France. The French became involved in the colonial enterprise in North America, referred to as New France here. They worked among the Huron, Sainte Marie among the Huron in Midland, Ontario specifically. Brebeuf believed that living as a Huron was the best way to reach these people. They traveled by canoes to Huronia. Once they mastered the language, they taught prayers, songs, catechism. He took part in oral disputations with village elders. He trained lay evangelists to preach and to teach. He led prayer groups and ascetic practices. Groups of pious women who gathered in celibate groups worked among the poor. Lots of converts. Many of the Huronians were slaughtered by the Iroquois, who wanted to replace Huron as a major trading partner with the French. Brebeuf and 7 others eventually were tortured and killed and became known as the Canadian Martyrs. This is a pro-Catholic version of the story, but it's a Canadian martyr story. We should be familiar with it.
Leaves show their full beauty and glory just before they die every fall. You know, the saints are kind of like that. You can usually see the full blast of God's glory shining through them at the end of their lives. Especially true of the martyrs who gave up their lives for the faith. I'm here in Midland, Ontario, where one of my heroes is buried, St. John de Brebeuf. He grew up in France in the 1600s. You know, he had the best of everything, high culture, went to the best universities. He left it all to come and serve the Huron Nation in Canada. But Canada's a really beautiful place today. But 400 years ago, it didn't have supermarkets, major cities, central heating, didn't have any of that stuff. And you know what else? It had roving bands of Iroquois determined to kill and torture every single Huron they met and every Frenchman they met. That was the land that John de Brebeuf ventured into alone on a canoe, looking for souls to serve. And when he approached the Huron, he didn't even know how to speak their language. Even after he was welcomed into their culture, though, life didn't get all that much easier. And he wrote home about the difficulties his fellow missionaries would encounter when they came to join his mission. He wrote about how it was almost impossible to sleep because the rodents would be crawling on you. You'd be bitten by fleas all the time. The longhouses were filled with smoke and you could barely see because there was no ventilation. He wrote about a culture where wives were often traded in gambling bets. It wasn't an easy place to be. And yet he didn't look down on them. He didn't judge them. He didn't think of himself better than them. He wrote about the beauty of their culture to his fellow missionaries too, about the generosity of their hearts, about their contemplative spirits, about how they'd be willing to lay down their lives for one another. And when he wrote to St. Isaac to prepare him for the mission, he said, "You must love these Huron, ransomed by the blood of the Son of God, as brothers." John de Brebeuf's ministry was marked by a superhuman courage. One of his friends wrote about him how nothing could disturb him during the 12 years I knew him. There was one time he arrived at a village and they debated whether or not they should kill him. They made him wait in a wigwam while they deliberated. When they came back to deliver the verdict, they found him taking a nap. Literally, nothing could disturb this man. He and his friends spent endless hours studying Huron culture, studying their language. It's because of them that we have written record of Huron culture and language. And his goal wasn't to crush their culture, but to embrace it, so that the light of Jesus Christ could shine through it in its own unrepeatable way. In 1649, a band of 1,000 Iroquois overran a fort where he and his friend, Father Gabriel, now St. Gabriel, were ministered to the Huron. The Huron begged them to flee because they knew they were all going to be killed, but they refused to. They said, no, I want to stay here and minister to you until the end. They underwent some of the worst tortures of any martyr in the history of the church. St. John was burned, had scalding hot water poured over him. He was stabbed. He had to watch pieces of his skin be filleted off and eaten in front of him. I hate going into that much gory detail, but it gives you a picture of this man's courage, you see, because through all that, he never cursed the people who were torturing him. He stood up straight and tall, and all he would say was, "Lord, have mercy." And through it all, he was thinking about his fellow prisoners, the Huron braves who would be tortured as well, and he was thinking about them and encouraging them in their faith. He said, "Bear up with courage under the few torments remaining. The sufferings will end with your lives. The grandeur which follows will never have an end." He lasted 4 hours under that torture, and his friend, St. Gabriel, lasted 16 hours. 7 years after their deaths, a little girl was born into the very tribe that had put them to death. Today, we know her as St. Kateri Tekakwitha, the first canonized Native American. By the time they had died, 7,000 Huron had become Christians. And within a 7-year span, 8 of the Jesuit martyrs would give their lives in a similar way to St. John and St. Gabriel. You know what Jesus showed us on the cross? Souls have a price tag. We don't win souls by standing on top of some ivory tower and calling down to the world and telling them to come up. We don't win converts and convince people to follow Jesus by treating the church like a fortress to keep sinners out and to keep us safe from the world. We do it as Jesus did, by breaking down walls, by reaching out to people to love and serve them, by treating people as brothers and sisters and loving them so sincerely that we don't just love them so that they convert and come to know the Lord, but we love them so much that even if they reject us and our message, we're still their brothers and sisters. That's the kind of witness that won the Huron over 400 years ago. It's the kind of witness the world needs today. Are you in?
Now, clearly very pro-Catholic, beautiful, sweet story, but it's interesting how an example of a traditional form of Christianity can encapsulate both glocal and global propensities, right? And then later on can look back and say, you know, we were probably very successful when we were more glocal. Maybe, I don't know. It's just interesting how you then rewrite the story in a way that makes your tradition a good tradition. Okay, none of this is wrong. This is how we do things, right? But you're looking at, when does Christianity force others, and then when does Christianity embrace the other and somehow accommodate itself to be embraced as the other still maintains their own cultural values. All right, so the basic principles subscribed to are characterized in Jesuit missions. Missionaries should learn the language of the people to whom they minister. Missionaries should adapt to indigenous cultural practices as much as possible. They should be preparing locals to assume leadership in the church. So this was the key to the Jesuit ability to make friends and converts across deep cultural divides all over the world. This did not make them very popular with European churchmen or with political leaders. It often put them and their converts at odds with European colonists, governors, and the military, who again approached at this, we are the superior, they must become like us, right? Quite a contrast within the same religious identity. It's quite remarkable. All right, let's go back to Eastern Europe, the Russian Orthodox missions. Russian Orthodox missions had similar characteristics to the Roman Catholic missions of the 15th through the 18th century. After the capture of Constantinople in 1453 by the Muslim Turks, the Russian state saw itself as the rightful successor to the Byzantine Empire. The Russian Tsars acted as protectors of the Christian minorities under Muslim rule. They also sent missionaries to Northern Asia. In 1700, Tsar Peter the Great made missions part of his policy of Russian expansionism, instructing the Metropolitan of Kiev to send missionaries to Siberia. By the end of that century, Russian Orthodox missions reached Alaska. Many Aleuts of Alaska became Orthodox by the mid-19th century. Modernity, the 18th century, era of contradictions. As we've already discussed, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment marked a paradigm shift, a radical new worldview in Western thought. Okay? So the focus now was on reason rather than faith. The focus was on the individual rights, and human potential rather than the divine right of kings. In turn, this led to the American and French revolutions and the consequent separation of church and state, democracy, and freedom of religion. Right? Artifacts of modernity. But it was an era of contradictions. At the same time this was happening, the Atlantic slave trade was at its height. How could such contradictions coexist? It's hard to disentangle religion from the political, economic, social, and cultural context. The slave trade was not only profitable, it was also essential to the running of the large plantations that fueled manufacturing. Evolutionary science was used to support it, with Christians deeming Africans, the Irish, Asians as less evolved species, claims that they were making. Biblical texts were used to support it. The New Testament, slavery was part of normal human society. Okay? Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven. Nowhere does the New Testament say slavery as a concept is wrong. And this then becomes justified in the minds of Christians in the 18th century, and they use biblical support for it. Okay? The Old Testament contains a curse against Canaan. Lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. All right, this is in Genesis 9. All right, so this idea that God encourages slavery and deems certain people, the entire people, as slaves becomes part of this biblical argument. I'm not saying it's a good argument. I'm just saying because it's in the Bible, people create these arguments. They bring science, they bring the Bible in to perpetuate, to continue this horrific practice. At the same time, though, we're getting the creation of a very distinctive Black Christianity. So we see the global intersecting with the glocal. The slave trade promoted the glocal development of Christianity in the Americas, a separate Black Christianity that differed significantly from the Christianity of their masters. Many slaves came from the kingdom of the Congo, which had been colonized by the Portuguese centuries before. Their Christianity combined African ideas about the spirit world with the Christian doctrines of the Portuguese. Other Blacks who embraced Christianity in America also did not completely abandon old world religion. Instead, they engaged in syncretism, blending Christian influences with traditional African rites and beliefs. Symbols and objects such as crosses were conflated with charms carried by Africans to ward off evil spirits. Jesus was interpreted as a healer similar to the priests of Africa. All right, so again, this mixing and blending. By the 19th century, then, Protestant creativity becomes vogue. Initially, Protestantism did not have an interest in missions to non-Christians. They were preoccupied with their own survival, struggling against Catholics and each other, and were formulating their own theological positions. The belief in predestination among some of the Protestants, that God had elected those who would be saved. So the business of conversion was God's problem and in no need of help from human agents. Since married clergy were the norm, they lacked the traditional structure for missions, celibate priests, monks, and nuns, singles who could go out into the world. If you're a married structure, what do you do with your spouse while you're the missionary, et cetera, et cetera? Catholicism had this, ready-made army of people available. Protestants didn't quite have this. Okay? Most Protestant countries lack borders with non-Christian countries. So we're less aware of non-European peoples than were Catholics. Most Lutheran and Reformed theologies did not contain a strong missionary dynamic that supported reaching beyond one's own national borders for the purpose of evangelization. In fact, the internationalization of Christianity through missions was seen as a defining characteristic of Catholicism. So if Catholics are doing it, Protestants who don't want to be like the Catholics saw no need to do it as well. This begins to change with Protestant groups like the Moravians. Okay? It is through the Moravians, Anabaptist pietists, that a truly Protestant model of missions developed. Okay? John Wesley met them in America, and it was they who started his conversion process. But it was a Baptist shoemaker, William Carey, who is considered to be the starting point of the modern Protestant missions. So the Moravians were a persecuted group. Consequently, they were always ready to immigrate to a new location and set up communities in the wilderness. They established farms and handicrafts for their own support and for the support of their converts. They set the pattern for using lay people as missionaries, breaking with the Roman Catholic model. They worked among African slaves in the Americas. They worked among indigenous peoples in the Americas, the West Indies, and Africa. Wherever they went, they faced opposition from the European colonists who enslaved the native peoples, stole their land, and did not want them empowered through education or evangelization. Because they focused on helping the powerless rather than converting the masses, the Moravians remained small. The Moravians in England began publishing a journal that contains reports of the missionary activities around the world. So, William Carey. Britain was becoming a major world power with colonies all over the world. William Carey was a self-educated Baptist shoemaker and preacher from Northampton, England. Right? He followed global events with interest. He became increasingly concerned with the need for missions to newly discovered peoples. He also read some of the first issues of the journal put out by the Moravians in England that contained these reports of their missionary activities around the world. In 1792, he wrote an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversions of the heathens, which surveyed the religions of the world, and he argued that Jesus' command to preach the gospel to all nations, found in Matthew 28, was relevant. Based on a vision, a group of Baptists founded the Baptist Missionary Society. They raised money through individual subscription. They sent Carey and his family to India as their first missionaries. They set about learning the native languages, and with the help of native language speakers, they translated the Bible, or at least portions of the Bible, into those languages. Carey and his group translated the Bible into 44 different languages. He himself translated the entire Bible into 3 Indian languages. The group also founded a college for training pastors. Right? The wife of one of those missionaries opened a school for girls. So the central characteristics of Protestant missions. One is Bible translations. Wherever missionaries went, they translated the Bible into indigenous languages. Unlike Catholic missionaries, Protestant missionaries believed that Bible translation was the key to spreading the true faith. Only when they could read the Bible themselves and understand the gospel message could they truly commit themselves to it. Bible translation was a collaborative affair between the missionary and the native speakers of the language. It employed indigenous modes of thought, a sense of ownership of Christian theology and traditions. The second key point is education. This was very important from the very beginning. What good were vernacular Bibles if people couldn't read? How could indigenous pastors be trained if there were no instruction? All the major missionary efforts founded schools with the goal of teaching literacy, training pastors, all beneficial to missionaries. It improved their own language capabilities and attracted people who would otherwise not be interested in Christianity. Evangelism and church planting. The training of indigenous evangelists and pastors. Missionaries were invariably accompanied by native translators or church members who translated not just the words, but the concepts into indigenous thought forms. Native converts had much more success in converting others than Europeans. For example, one mission society even put its white missionaries under the leadership of an African bishop in the 19th century. It didn't work out because of racial prejudice, but at least the attempt was there. So, new expressions of Christianity. The World's Christians points out that the Protestant missionary activity was generally globalizing enterprise, dedicated to inculcating Western values, culture, and Christianity. Nevertheless, those very Protestant values resulted in the indigenization, the act of making something more native, of Christianity. A process that included natives reading the Bible for themselves, interpreting the Bible for themselves, applying the Bible to their own lives. All of this led to new expressions of Christianity. Just as the Reformation led to the development of many new forms of Christianity when brought to non-European cultures, it led to new local forms of Christianity reflecting the cultures and values of those new contexts. Okay? Your text provides examples from Africa and China. However, Protestant creativity was also unleashed. There were new American religions. We've talked about that in the past. The LDS, the Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Scientists, Jehovah's Witnesses, which makes all of those globalist traditions. They're American. They're formed because of what had become American culture, brand new forms of Christianity. All right? Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Science, and Jehovah's Witnesses, examples of globalist traditions. There was also the beginning of changing attitude towards slavery based on new ways of reading the Bible, looking for deeper message of equality and liberty for all, working from that kind of American ideal of equality and liberty for all, then going back and, okay, not all Americans are doing this, but certain Christian Americans are saying, no, because of these values, we now reinterpret our traditional way of thinking. 20th century redistribution of Christianity. It's a time of great disillusionment. Europe and America suffered through two world wars. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, fought from 1914 to 1918, mostly fought on European soil. World War II from 1939 to 1945, a conflict that virtually involved everyone on the planet. And you know this now, influenza pandemic in 1918, exactly like the COVID pandemic today, over 100 years ago. All these things were going on. The pandemic killed more people than the war. By estimates, 20 to 40 million people on this planet were killed by the 1918 pandemic. And then after that, in the 1930s, a huge economic depression because of the stock market crash of 1929. It wasn't the sole cause of the Great Depression, but it did act to accelerate global economic collapse, of which it was also a symptom. By 1933, nearly half of American banks had failed. Unemployment was approaching 15 million people, or 30% of the workforce. You follow this with the Cold War. This is something I grew up with. Maybe some of you only know from your parents any familiarity with this. This was a state of political military tension after World War II between powers in the Eastern Bloc of Europe, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and powers in the Western Bloc, the United States and its NATO allies. This was an ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. It had a great impact on American domestic life as well. People were building bomb shelters in their backyards. People were practicing drills in schools and other public places in case the bomb went off. The 1950s and the 1960s saw an epidemic of popular films that horrified moviegoers with depictions of nuclear devastation and mutant creatures. I mean, that's where Godzilla comes from. The whole Godzilla out of Japan comes from the idea of nuclear waste creating these monsters. Okay? You should see the kinds of films in America that were created with huge insects and beasts. So in these and other ways, the Cold War was a constant presence in America's everyday lives. And now you have increasing secularism in Europe and Canada. There is no one model of secularism, even in the democratic West, where the relation of religion to state has taken many diverse forms. The identification of Christianity with the American way of life still maintains. You see it all the time in the press. Okay? Majority of Americans identify with Christianity, even though historically the United States has always been marked by religious pluralism and diversity. Then we have the end of colonialism. More and more independence from political control of the European American. Right? Christian churches, both missionary and independent, had a chance to grow and mature in their own ways and on their own terms. We talked before about liberation theology, first conceived in the 1950s and the 1960s. It's a reinterpretation of Christian theology which emphasizes a concern for the liberation of the oppressed. Again, this is an example of a post-colonial theology. And what is the rise of neocolonialism? The use of economic, political, culture, other pressures control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies. Right? That's what colonialism. What is neocolonialism? Okay? It is the practice of using capitalism, globalization, and cultural imperialism to influence a developing country in lieu of direct military control, imperialism, and indirect political control, hegemony. The global economy and its vice grip on developing nations. All right, still continuing. Christianity becoming a global movement. Increasingly, even dispersal of the Christian population worldwide due to low birth rates. Conversion to Pentecostal charismatic movement. We talked about this. All right. It's great in a lot of people's imagination because it came with no colonial baggage. It's post-colonial. Right? It encourages local autonomy, local cultural adaptation. Very glocal. There are absolutely no education requirements. And one follows the spirit, not a degree. Okay? It's very empowering. One's gaining spiritual power. It's granting one a sense of power over one's normal life. And it emphasizes joy. That's its focus. That's what it offers. That's what it seems to generate, and people respond very positively to that. Okay, conclusion. The relationship between globalization and glocalization. Looking at the globalization of Christianity through the lens of globalization, in other words, the exportation or imposition of one's ways on doing things by powerful global actors on others, and glocalization. All right. Yes. And glocalization, the creative mixing together of bits and pieces from different cultures of the world by local actors to create new hybrid realities, allows us to see some of the complexities of the spread of Christianity around the globe. All right. At a macro level, there's a general movement from an emphasis on globalization to an emphasis on glocalization. From the empire building of the age of discovery to the enculturization of local churches through the world in the post-colonial era. Upon closer inspection, each era of Christian expansion experienced elements of both. In fact, it is the tension between these two forces that has led to the development of new forms of Christianity and the revitalization of older forms. Although we didn't start with the earliest centuries of Christianity and work our way through all 2016 of them, I have no doubt we could see those dynamics at work from the travels of Paul onward. Okay, that's it. Let me turn off sharing. Any questions? I'm going to turn off recording.